Some great journalism coming out of the Grayzone as usual. I invite you to watch the recent video they did about this man called Brian Kern, who happens to be an ex-Amnesty International worker. He's been the go-to person for the Western media to report on the Hong Kong protests. And as you know, a certain part of the Hong Kong protests are funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a CIA front. And so protesters like Joshua Wong are funded by the National Endowment for Democracy to stir up trouble and to vilify the Chinese government, because there's a coming war on China and you have to make China a target and also demonize communism at the same time. And so this person, Brian Kern, has been the go-to person about the Hong Kong protests, but it turns out that he is doubling as pretending to be a Hong Kong protester, a native Hong Kong protester. And the Western media never show his face when they interview him, and he's giving reports about what's happening in Hong Kong. He also has written, and of course it's always anti the Chinese government and sort of putting out the national security state talking points, the US national security state talking points about China. Because as you know, there's a coming war on China, so they have to vilify the Chinese Communist Party and vilify China to set up for an invasion at some point, and they want to economically destroy China as well. And I've done a recent video about TikTok and WhatsApp. You can check that out. So this person, Brian Kern, is basically been going around in the Hong Kong protests and helping the rioters. He's also been seen talking with the Hong Kong Free Press, which is a very large Western media source in China. He's often the go-to for that particular group. And I have to wonder whether I'm going to read shortly a spiel from Max Blumenthal about this particular person. And this is very sinister, really, because he's helping manufacture consent through these various Western media news sources, including the one in China, for a war on China, basically. I don't know how these people sleep at night, and I have to wonder actually if he's funded also by the National Endowment for Democracy, some CIA setup, because he's very dedicated. At one point, he's actually calling for the Chinese police in Hong Kong to shoot him. Shoot us all, he says. I'll show you the little video that they did, and that's funny because there was people behind him that I was thinking to myself, I don't think they want the Chinese police to be shooting them. Of course, he doesn't. He knows that they're not going to do that, but it's all very drama filled, and he's sort of very dedicated to this. So he's pretending to be a Hong Kong native. I think he's pretending to be. I think his name is Kong Tsung-gan, and he has a Twitter account, and he's pretending to be this native Hong Kong person who is against what the Chinese government is doing in Hong Kong. He's against the security measures and all of that. And he's sort of instigating rioters in there. Sounds very CIA-like to me. Doesn't it sound like that to you? That just sounds like a typical CIA operation to me. I would really like to see his bank account and see, who's probably funding him, because he's so dedicated. I can't believe that he's just doing this because he's a, what would you say, ill-guided or misguided character who doesn't really understand the situation. I mean, of course, Hong Kong protesters, some of them have legitimate grievances, but they're actually because neoliberalism is in Hong Kong and the rents are crazy and all of that. I don't think it has a whole lot to do with the Chinese Communist government there. And so they have some legitimate complaints about, the cost of living and all of that, but I don't think that's to do with the Chinese Communist government. I think it's more to do with just neoliberalism. And but the actual things that Joshua Wong is talking about in this whole, the Communist Chinese Party is bad, even though, yes, of course, all governments have got problems, but the Chinese Communist Party government has actually pulled about 800 million people out of poverty. That's something that the United States could never say. So, there's anything that the US government is saying about China, like as if they're some sort of moral authority on human rights in their own country, and that they're not going around the world invading countries left and right or threatening to invade or meddling with governments as they have done, 60-plus governments, 60-plus countries' governments over the last, since 1945. They've meddled in and overthrown or attempted to overthrow. I don't think you could say the Chinese government has done that. Of course, you'll never ever hear anybody who is pointing the finger and vilifying the Chinese government and China. You'll never hear them ever vilifying and criticizing their own government. How about any US citizens that are pointing the finger at China and are not criticizing their own government? And there's so much to criticize, and this is before Trump too. Trump is not an aberration. This shite show that's been going on in the US, the poverty, the social inequality, killing black people, imperialist adventures and endless war that they're creating and engaging in. And the list goes on and on and on. Guantanamo Bay, the way they treat refugees and asylum seekers. The list goes on and on of the problems over there. And here are these some misguided US citizens pointing the finger at China. Just look in your own backyard. My goodness, it's way, 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 way more problematic. All governments lie. All governments are problematic. But who is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world? The US empire is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And that's who we should be concerned about. That's who we should be concerned about. The US government should be minding its own business and fixing up its own problems. But of course, it doesn't want to. And the aim of the US empire is full spectrum dominance. That's what its aims are. So that all this vilification, and Brian Kern is assisting in this vilification of China and the Chinese Communist Party and all of that, is all for the end purpose to economically destroy and also to invade China, which could end up in a big mushroom cloud for all of us. Because China is a nuclear power, and it's not Afghanistan, and it's not Iraq, and it's not Yemen, and all of that. This country should not. And no country should be messed with, but definitely not China. If they think that China is going to roll over, or that they're actually going to be able to do their usual shtick that they do in every other country to overthrow the government, I think they're sorely mistaken. This time I think they would bite off way more than they can chew, and that also includes the way they're treating Iran. And Iran and China are becoming more and more closely allied, and that's because of this. The US is basically trying to pick off every country that has not submitted to it yet. My country has submitted to the US. It's a vassal state. And they overthrew our government. The CIA helped overthrow my government in 1975, and it's been a neoliberal cluster F ever since. But this is something that the US is going around trying to destabilize and overthrow or invade any country that hasn't submitted yet. So we need to spread this information around. When the Grayzone puts out really excellent reports like this about Brad Kern, we need to spread it around to as many people as possible to basically indicate who is the villain here. Who is the villain? Who is the one behind this sort of thing? I really think that since the US is the major driver of this war, this provocation of China in the South China Sea, and the pivot to Asia and all of that, I would say that behind this man and all the other ones that are trying to stir up stuff about China in the Hong Kong protests, etc. The force behind that is U.S. national security state operations. Anyway, I'm going to read you this because it's a good report, or maybe I'll just show you the video, one or the other, but it's excellent reporting, and I'm so glad we have the Grayzone and the Empire Files and all those different independent journalists, because otherwise we really wouldn't know what the hell was going on. So thanks for watching. Stay tuned and check this out. Western media's favourite Hong Kong freedom struggle writer is American ex-Amnesty staffer in yellow face, by Max Blumenthal from the Grayzone. A prominent Hong Kong pundit and anti-China activist named Kong Tsung-gan has become a go-to source for Western media. An investigation by the Grayzone confirms Kong as a fake identity employed by an American teacher who's a ubiquitous figure at local protests. An American man with ties to Amnesty International and key Hong Kong separatist figures has been posing online as a Hong Kong native named Kong Tsung-gan. Routinely cited as a grassroots activist and writer by major media organizations and published in English-language media, the fictitious character Kong has been concocted to disseminate anti-China propaganda behind the cover of Yellowface. Through Kong Tsung-gan's prolific digital presence and uninterrogated reputation in mainstream Western media, he disseminates a concrete stream of content hyping up the Hong Kong, quote, freedom struggle, end quote, while clamoring for the US to turn up the heat on China. Whispers about Kong's true identity have been circulating on social media among Hong Kong residents and was even mentioned in a brief account last December by The Standard. The Grayzone spoke to several locals outraged by a deceptive stunt they considered not only unethical but racist. They said they have kept their views to themselves due to the atmosphere of intimidation looming over the city, where self-styled, quote, freedom fighters, end quote, harass and target seemingly anyone who speaks out publicly against them. In this investigation, the Grayzone connected the dots between Kong and an American man who has become a major presence in Western media and at protests around Hong Kong. Our research indicates that Kong's editors and prominent protest cheerleaders were likely aware of the deceptive ploy. Kong Tsung-gan's bursts onto Hong Kong Twitter scene becomes go-to source for anti-China content. The Twitter user Kong Tsung-gan first appeared in March 2015. Kong Tsung-gan's earliest tweets featured commentary about Tibet and the Hong Kong umbrella movement. At some point, Kong changed his Twitter avatar to a black and white headshot of an unknown Asian person. A search of the Wayback Machine Internet Archive shows that this photo remained up until sometime in late 2019. Later, Kong changed his Twitter avatar to an image depicting Liu Ji, the wife of the late Nobel Prize-winning dissident Liu Zhibao. Liu Zhibao was a right-wing ideologue who celebrated the U.S. wars on Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, and was rewarded with 2014 Democracy Award by the National Endowment for Democracy, the favorite meddling machine of the U.S. government. As of August 2020, Kong Tsung-gan's Twitter account boasts more than 32,000 followers. He live tweets during protests, posts incendiary commentary about the Communist Party of China, likens the Hong Kong's, quote, struggle, end quote, to Tibet and Xinjiang, begs the United States to ram through sanction bills like the Hong Kong Safe Harbor and Hong Kong People's Freedom and Choice Acts, urges NBA star LeBron James to, quote, find out about our freedom struggle, end quote, retweets Nancy Pelosi and other U.S. politicians, promotes his books, maintains an ongoing tally of arrests in his regular hashtag HK Crackdown Watch update, and disseminates images of protest posters. At around the time he created his Twitter account, Kong Tsung-gan published his first Medium post. He has since filled his Medium feed with protest timelines, lists of recommended human rights books, and journalism, including a link to the questionable China, quote, expert, end quote, Adrian Zenz, and, quote, first-hand accounts, end quote, of his protest experiences on the ground. In one account, Kong Tsung-gan claimed he attended a Band 1 government school, implying he was a native Hong Kong resident. Kong's work has been amplified by Joshua Wong, the Hong Kong protest poster boy who has enjoyed photo ops with neoconservative Republican senators like Marco Rubio and Tom Cotton. Thanks to his continual stream of content on Twitter and Medium and his platform on the website Hong Kong Free Press, Kong Tsung-gan has become one of the mainstream Western media go-to sources for sound bites. Kong Tsung-gan, darling of the Western press. Since bursting onto the Hong Kong Twitter scene, Kong Tsung-gan has been quoted by a who's who of Western corporate media outlets. He has been described as an author, the CNN, Globe and Mail, Time, quote, writer and activist, New York Times, Washington Post, quote, activist and author, end quote, LA Times, activist, end quote, AFP, Al Jazeera, quote, writer, educator and activist, end quote, The Guardian, quote, political writer, end quote, foreign policy, writer, Vice, and Hong Kong writer and activist in an op-ed posted by the Nikkei Asian Review. Kong has also been cited as a, quote, Hong Kong journalist and rights activist, end quote, by Radio Free Asia, and as a, quote, rights activist and author, end quote, by Voice of America, two subsidiaries of U.S. Agency for Global Media, USAGM. Tasked with a mission to be, quote, consistent with the broad foreign policy objectives of the United States, end quote, the USAGM budgeted around $2 million to support protests in Hong Kong in 2020. When he is not churning out commentary on Twitter and Medium accounts, Kong Tsung-gan is a columnist at Hong Kong Free Press, HKFP, and publishes books about the Hong Kong, quote, freedom struggle, end quote, whose proceeds go directly to Hong Kong Free Press. Hong Kong Free Press describes itself as an, quote, impartial non-profit media outlet, end quote, and, quote, completely independent, end quote. The outlet also boasted that it, quote, gets full marks, end quote, from a supposed journalism ethics verification initiative called NewsGuard, which happens to be overseen by a collection of former U.S. government, national security, and law enforcement officials. HKFP editor-in-chief Tom Grundy has boasted of rejecting article pitches from deceptive figures operating behind false identities. At the same time, Grundy has provided a regular home for Kong's commentary. The Grayzone emailed HKFP to request a comment on Kong's identity but received no reply. the distinctly American voice of Kong Tsung-gan. To burnish his reputation as a reliable source, Kong Tsung-gan has furnished audio interviews to Western outlets. In July 2019, Kong Tsung-gan was featured on Louisa Lim's Little Red podcast alongside National Endowment for Democracy fellow Johnson Yun, lawmaker Eddie Chow Ho-dik, and former Hong Kong Chief Secretary Anson Chan. Around the same time, an American man in Hong Kong named Brian Kern spoke to RTHK at a march commemorating the Tiananmen Square anniversary. A close listen to both audio clips along with an interview Kong furnished to an Italian interviewer demonstrates that Kong Tsung-gan and Brian Kern are the same person. Listen to yourself here or in the video embedded at the top of this article. Indeed, the distinctly American voices of Kong Tsung-gan and Brian Kern are the same. So why have news outlets like Hong Kong Free Press failed to disclose that Kong Tsung-gan is a pen name for an American man? Who is Brian Kern and why is he yellow-facing as Kong Tsung-gan? In plain sight, American teacher coordinating with Hong Kong protesters. Brian Patrick Kern has been a fixture at the Hong Kong protests since they erupted in 2019. He has been profiled by the Chinese press, photographed cleaning egg stains off the walls of the police headquarters and escorting his children to demonstrations. Kern has been even filmed coordinating with protesters and rioters in videos circulating on social media. In another video that went viral on social media, Kern was filmed screaming at the police, quote, "You're a communist puppet, kill us all. With your bug gun, shoot me. I'm so violent, I'm a violent rioter, shoot me. Your communist masters will love you," end quote. Brian Kern also writes for the Hong Kong Free Press as a guest contributor under his own name. Clearly, Kern enjoys the spotlight and has no apparent fear of local authorities. But few people know that Brian Kern also hides behind the persona of Kong Tsung-gan, furnishing quotes to media outlets across the West as an expert native source on the Hong Kong, quote, freedom struggle, end quote. Brian Kern publishes anti-China books under at least 2 pseudonyms. Not only does Brian Patrick Kern write as Kong Tsung-gan, which he romanized to seem like a Hong Kong native, he also writes under the pen name Jun Yuzhang, romanized to appear as a Chinese mainlander. Writings under both aliases are filled with warnings of the, quote, creeping control of the Chinese Communist Party, end quote. As Kong Tsung-gan, Brian Kern has published 3 books, Umbrella, A Political Tale from Hong Kong, Pema Press, As Long as There is Resistance, There is Hope, Essays on the Hong Kong Freedom Struggle in the Post-Umbrella Movement Era 2014 to 2018, Pema Press, and Liberate Hong Kong Stories from the Freedom Struggle, Mekong Review. As Jun Yuzhang, Brian Kern has published Liberationist, Pema Press, which, quote, tells the story of a human rights worker who disappears while crossing the border between Hong Kong and mainland China, end quote. One reviewer wrote, quote, like many debut novels, Liberationists, a work weighed down by its own good intentions, end quote. In a book, Jun Yuzhang discloses that it was published under a pseudonym. No matter which aliases he is employing, Brian Kern's mission is clear, to portray the CPC as one of the world's most dangerous evildoers. Kern's books also are filled with clues exposing him as the man behind both Jun Yuzhang and Kong Tsung-gan. Jun Yuzhang dedicated the book Liberationist to Mei Ren, quote, who struggles so long to be free, end quote. Brian Kern's mother is named Mei Ren. Liberationist was also dedicated to someone referred to as simply Y. Similarly, Kong Tsung-gan dedicated Liberate Hong Kong Stories from the Freedom Struggle to, quote, Y for the shared struggle, end quote. The name of Brian Kern's wife, Yatman, begins with the letter Y. Pema Press is the publisher for the work by Jun and Kong. Brian Kern's daughter happens to be named Pema, the same name as the publisher. In brackets, it is possible Kern named both his publishing house and his daughter after Jetsun Pema, sister of the Dalai Lama, with whom he and his wife worked in the Tibetan Children's Villages charity, end brackets. Kern's Orientalist stunt could be compared to that of Michael Derrick Hudson, a white middle-aged poet from Indiana who struggled to get his work published until he began submitting it to journals under the pseudonym Yi-Fen Chow. Unlike Hudson's fake Chinese persona, however, Kern is a political actor posing as a native grassroots activist to spread propaganda. His ploy is therefore more reminiscent of the, quote, gay girl in Damascus, end quote, hoax, in which Tom McMaster, a 40-year-old American graduate student at the University of Edinburgh, posed as a Damascus-based lesbian activist named Amina Araf Jinnah left liberal support for regime change in Syria throughout 2011. Kern's personal profile is similar to McMaster as well. Both are activist-minded liberal internationalist types with PhDs in literature. But unlike McMaster, who forged a career in academia, Kern also has a record of work in the human rights industry. Brian Kern grew up in Minnesota and completed his PhD in comparative literature at Brown University in 1996. In 1998, he began teaching at the Red Cross Nordic United World College, UWCRCN, in Norway, where he met his wife Yatman Cheng. Cheng graduated from UWCRCN in 2002 and received a Jardine Foundation scholarship to attend Oxford. In 2003 or 2004, as a university student, she volunteered at Tibetan children's villages in India on a trip organised by her college and led by Brian Kern. In 2004, Chen became a summer intern at the Hong Kong think tank Civil Exchange, which has received funding from the National Democratic Institute, a subsidiary of the US government-funded National Endowment for Democracy. Cheng and Kern lived in London in 2007, where Kern worked for Amnesty International as a member of their education team. In 2008, they moved to Hong Kong, where Kern began teaching at the Chinese International School and established its Human Rights Club. A few of Kern's former students appeared to work with him behind the cover of his false Asian identity. Several have translated work by Joshua Wong for Kong Tsung-gan's Medium blog, and one designed the cover for one of Kong Tsung-gan's books. Where is Brian Kern now? Brian Patrick Kern was last seen in public on May 24, 2020, marching with lawmaker Eddie Chow Hoi Dick in a demonstration against China's national security law. Weeks later, Kong Tsung-gan published his next book, Liberate Hong Kong, Stories from the Freedom Struggle. Hong Kong's last British colonial governor, Chris Patten, praised the tract as, quote, a fascinating insider's look at what has happened, which will be a defining issue for China's place in the 21st century, end quote. Did Chris Patten know Kong Tsung-gan was a made-up person? And how about Tom Grundy, the editor-in-chief of Hong Kong Free Press? Did he know that his columnist, Kong, was actually an American named Brian Kern? Below, Brian Kern can be seen warmly greeting Grundy during the June 2019 Wan Chai police station siege. This August, Kong Tsung-gan published a long-winded diatribe against China's national security law in the Mekong Review, clamoring for harsh U.S. sanctions on Beijing, while acknowledging in small print at the end of the essay that Kong was a pen name. Kern continued to insinuate that he was a Hong Kong native. Quote, an addition of just how draconian the CCP edict is that I could be arrested, charged with, quote, colluding with foreign forces, end quote, and face up to life in prison just for calling for sanctions on CCP and HK officials, end quote, he wrote. In reality, the author was not colluding with foreign forces, he was the foreign force. According to Hong Kong locals contacted by the Grayzone, Kern is rumoured to have left the city.